It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. We're now at the third week of our Christopher Lee Dracula Movies Month on Monster Mondays. Now, last week, we talked about Dracula, Prince of Darkness. That movie is often considered the most quintessential Hammer Dracula film, even if it really isn't the best. It's not bad, but it's probably not as well remembered or as well liked as Horror of Dracula. But that said, it did establish a stylistic formula. Dracula is resurrected by a follower of his. He turns at least one person into a vampire. That new vampire is generally dispatched in a more mundane way, like getting staked in the heart, while Dracula's death is more of a spectacular sort of way of killing a vampire. But now it is 1968, and Dracula has risen from the grave. Now, first and foremost, I always liked that one of the most common promotional posters for the movie is featuring a woman wearing two pink band-aids covering her bite marks with the title underneath the image. And then beneath the title, in parentheses, is the punchline of obviously. It's such a bizarre joke to make on a poster for a horror movie that will end with somebody staked on a golden cross, bleeding from the eyes, screaming in pain and agony before he withers away in the dust. But, I do like that poster. Anyway, this fourth film in the Hammer Dracula series didn't exactly garner a great deal of positive reviews at the time, but it is considered maybe more of a triumph of style over anything else. Originally, Terence Fisher was meant to direct, but he had to drop out. So Academy Award-winning cinematographer Freddie Francis stepped in to direct. Francis would rotate back and forth between directing films and directing the photography of films throughout his career. But some of his best-known works actually come as a cinematographer. He shot The Elephant Man, Dune, and The Straight Story for David Lynch. He won his second Oscar for Glory, and then followed that up by working for Martin Scorsese on Cape Fear. Meanwhile, Christopher Lee would ultimately move to Hollywood in the late 70s as he tried to put some distance between himself and the role of Count Dracula. However, not long before that, though, he did manage to be the very best thing in a James Bond movie. He played the villain Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun, which is one of my very least favorite films in the entire series. Where everything kind of misses or falls flat on its face, Christopher Lee is actually an amazing and extremely imposing Bond villain. However, it seemed like, for the most part, he didn't really get to score a whole lot of roles in A pictures, at least through the end of the 70s and into the 90s. He was a villain in the second Captain America TV movie starring Reb Brown, and he would appear with Brown again in The Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf. But you can just kind of tell by that title, first of all, it's the second Howling movie, but I always thought the subtitle was kind of a joke. You know, it's like, Your Sister's a Werewolf, dude. You know, or something like that. It's kind of a joke to me. So you can kind of see, like, he's getting name recognition, or he's, being brought in for name recognition, but with Captain America 2 on TV and Howling 2, Your Sister's a Werewolf, not exactly great films to be recognized for Christopher Lee being in. Now, for the most part, except for the occasional bigger budget project like Steven Spielberg's 1941, he missed out on some other big roles as well. He always regretted turning down the role in Airplane that would ultimately launch Leslie Nielsen into a superstar comedic career. He was considered for the role of Magneto in the X-Men series, but that eventually went to Ian McKellen. He did show up as the bioscientist in Gremlins 2, but for the most part, it really wasn't until Peter Jackson came calling to select Lee to play the evil Saruman in the Lord of the Rings trilogy that things really kind of turned around at the latter end, or at the very end of his career. Now, that was quickly followed up by him playing the fallen Jedi Count Dooku in Star Wars Episode 2 and Episode 3. but afterwards he mostly worked on Tim Burton films of the 2000s. In 2009, Lee was knighted by Prince Charles, but due to his age and the physical condition due to that age, he was allowed to forego the kneeling part and was knighted standing. He passed away in June of 2015, having celebrated nearly 7 decades of acting professionally and a pretty profitable star across his 213 film and 65 TV credits. But as for this movie, it opens with a young man excitedly riding his bike into the village to start the day at the church where he'll be sweeping up and kind of taking care of the place. As he's about to ring the bell, he discovers blood coming from the bell tower. He goes up and screams at what he finds, a young woman who's been shoved into the bell after being killed by Dracula. A year passes, and this is now after the events of the previous movie. Monsignor Ernst Muller is coming to the village, making his usual rounds. The boy who discovered the body, the altar boy of the church, is now a terrified mute. The priest of the church is struggling with his faith. And this doesn't really sit well with the Monsignor. He's not pleased with the priest not conducting mass as normal. He's not happy that the priest is boozing it up at the bar. He's not happy that the rest of the town is still frightened by the specter of Dracula. So Muller asks the priest to show him the way to the mountains to exorcise the supposed evil that still lurks at the castle. And the priest really only makes it about halfway up the mountain and is forced to stay behind while Muller continues on. He arrives at the castle and begins the rite of exorcism, and the sky starts rumbling and lightning and thunder carries on during the ceremony. Now, one thing of note that starts here is whenever you see the castle or Dracula himself, the edges of the film frames are tinged red, yellow, and amber. It almost looks like evil is seeping through into the frame. Now, during the storm, the priest slips on the rocks and begins bleeding. The blood then seeps into a crack in the frozen water and into Dracula's mouth, which restores him back to life. Dracula then takes control of the scaredy-cat priest, but since the Monsignor placed the cross on the door of the castle, Dracula is unable to return inside. So he orders his priest to tell him who did this, and this leads them both to go to Keinenberg to take revenge on the Monsignor. Now, before they hit the road, the priest digs up a coffin for his new master and just dumps out the body so Dracula can use it. It's such a little thing, but it's so funny. You just see this lady get dumped out of her casket so Dracula can use it. In Keinenberg, Muller's niece, Maria, is bringing a friend to her birthday dinner, her boyfriend, Paul. Now, Paul is of fine breeding. He plans on becoming a doctor. And Maria at first is a little miffed with Paul because he's dragged into a drinking game that gets beer spilled onto him just as she meets him at the pub where he works and where he has an apartment over. Now, at first, the meeting of Paul with Maria's mother, Anna, and the Monsignor goes off pretty well, but then Paul reveals that he's an atheist, and that just causes the Monsignor to flip his lid, which also causes Paul to have to leave. Paul ends up getting schnockered at the pub, and the beer maiden, Zena, is about to take advantage of the situation with the handsome Paul, but Maria shows up after sneaking out of her own room and walking across the rooftops to go into Paul's room. Now, Zena walks home alone and is chased by Dracula's carriage, but when she avoids being run over, she runs right into Dracula, who bites the girl. In the morning, Paul says goodbye to Maria, meaning, I suppose, they spent the night together. And that seems a little risque for the era, I suppose. But anyway, that day, the priest arrives at the pub after Zena has gone back to work and asks for a room to rent, to which Zena speaks for the owner to give him a room. When Paul helps the priest take his stuff to the room next to his, the priest asks if he happens to know the Monsignor, and of course Paul says that he knows his niece much better, and that gives the priest reason to pause and contemplate. Later, Dracula rises from his coffin located in the basement of the pub and commands that Zena bring Maria to her. When she asks why he would want Maria, when he's got her, he slaps her and angrily commands her again to have her go get Maria and have her come to her and go into the basement where he'll be waiting for her. Xena does eventually trick Maria to go to the bakery in the basement, where she puts a bag over her head to drag her to Dracula. Dracula attempts to take control over her, but Paul is able to scare Dracula off. Disappointed in his slave's inability to bring Maria to him, Dracula kills Xena, and the priest ends up using the fireplace in the bakery to cremate the woman. At her home, Maria is still affected by the terrible sight of Dracula. Dracula comes to her home and puts the whammy on her and then bites her. The next morning, the Monsignor sees that she has a bite on her throat, and that very next night, Dracula comes for more feeding, but this time, the Monsignor busts in with a crucifix just in time. Dracula has to run off, and Muller runs into the priest on the rooftops and is pushed off onto a ledge where he is fatally injured. Anna helps bandage up the Monsignor, and he asks her to bring Paul to the house so he can speak to him. He feels that Paul can save Maria because of his love for her. So he gives Paul what he needs to know and gets him ready to do battle with Dracula. Paul, not realizing the priest is one of Dracula's servants, comes back to the Mullers with him, and the Monsignor sees the priest and dies. The priest then helps Paul prepare the room to kind of stave off Dracula. Now, still under Dracula's control, though, the priest does knock Paul out, but he does resist removing the garlic and the crosses around Maria. Paul then has the priest take him to Dracula, where they plan to stake the vampire, but neither can actually say the accompanying prayer, as Paul is an atheist and the priest is faithless. So Dracula is able to pull the stake out of his own heart and throws it back at the two heroes. And then Dracula escapes and kidnaps Maria and plans to go to the castle, where he plans to spend the rest of the night with her there and turn her into a vampire. But Paul tries to get help from the villagers to get directions to Castle Dracula, but they all initially refuse. Paul does get help from the mute altar boy. He gets to the castle just after Maria removes the cross from the door. And Paul and Dracula have a bit of a tussle that ends with Dracula falling off the cliff and impaling himself on that very same cross that was removed from the door. The priest, finally regaining his faith, gives the prayer to kill Dracula just as the priest himself dies. Paul has regained his own faith in light of all this crazy monster stuff. So the movie ends with the cross shining in the foreground of Castle Dracula like it's straight out of the conclusion of a Castlevania game. Now let's get to the three things that I like about Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. First, I quite like Rupert Davies playing Monsignor Muller. He's a stuffy old man, but he's kind of tough too. He's strong with faith as well, which proves to be necessary in battling Dracula. Overall, Davies shows his veteran ability as an actor. He died less than 10 years after this movie's release, but he had a fairly long and busy career as mostly a character actor. And he definitely looks the part of an experienced man of the cloth and has a really good command of the movie when he's featured in scenes throughout the film. Now, second, I think this movie has a bit more life to it than the previous films. Despite Monsignor Muller being kind of a badass, he's a very good family man with his widowed sister-in-law Anna and his niece Maria. Paul and Maria's relationship is youthful and cute as well. The town of Keinenberg itself has a party feel to it, with the pub being the primary social gathering for everyone that usually devolves into drinking contests and games. The previous films had the stuffier types of characters that were fine for those films, but not exactly teeming with the life of this film, if you kind of get what I'm saying there. I think it has to do with the fact that the bar itself is loaded with extras that you didn't often see in the other films. The other films didn't really take advantage of a lot of scenes with a lot of extras. Now, thirdly, I do like how the makeup and effects have evolved a little bit. The bite marks on the victims look necrotic, like the skin around the puncture is dying away. It looks pestilent, but it also makes more sense, right? Like when you get a really bad snake or very venomous spider bite, it can cause that necrosis to form around the actual bite where the venom was injected right into your body. It seems like if a demon like a vampire bites you, it would probably be kind of gnarly. The immature guy in me also thinks that the actual puncture wounds, because they are raised the way that they are, also looks like two nipples, but I digress. Additionally, while they scale back on the gushing blood stuff, Lee's got those severely bloodshot eyes that make my eyes water and itch like crazy every time I see them. He also bleeds from the eyes and mouth when he's impaled by the cross at the end. It's a pretty solid and effective makeup work too, because it's that glorious bright red. I also like that the priest, once in the thrall of Dracula, looks pale and kind of deathly. I actually thought at first that the altar boy was fed on too, because he has this sickly gray makeup on him, but that turned out just to be more of a product of being frightened. He still, he still has that look that he, lost all of the color in his skin, as well as losing his voice. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on FilmSeizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. Additionally, hop on over to Facebook and Twitter to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday. So, until next week, stay spooky.